Naomi Green, a sergeant in the U.S. Army, was nearing the end of her long journey home after 10 grueling months of service in a Middle Eastern conflict zone. She had just passed through airport security. Her military uniform was impeccably pressed, and her insignia gleamed on her shoulders. Naomi moved through the crowded terminal with trained confidence, but inside she felt a profound weariness. Her eyes betrayed sleepless nights spent far from home, and her tense shoulders bore the weight of all she had endured over the past months. Her ticket for the flight from Washington to Los Angeles was for a standard economy seat, which she had purchased in advance. Naomi never complained about discomfort. Her service had accustomed her to far harsher conditions. However, as she approached the check-in counter, she learned her seat had been upgraded to first class as part of a veterans program. This unexpected gesture of courtesy from the airline evoked mixed feelings in her. She appreciated the kindness, but understood that such privileges could sometimes draw unwanted attention. Walking through the gate, Naomi noticed the glances from those around her. Many passengers eyed her military uniform with curiosity. Some looked on with respect, others with indifference. There were also those whose expressions conveyed something more, a veiled skepticism mixed with surprise. One woman, holding a small child by the hand, stepped aside as if the military uniform itself was something intimidating. Naomi was used to such reactions, but they still stung slightly each time. As she approached the plane, she smiled at the flight attendant, who directed her to her seat in first class. The first-class cabin, bathed in soft lighting, seemed like a world far removed from her military reality. The spacious leather seats, polished finishes, and serene atmosphere stood in stark contrast to the cramped and noisy transport planes she had spent much of the past months aboard. Naomi quickly found her window seat. Removing her backpack, she carefully placed it in the overhead compartment. Although unassuming in appearance, the backpack held deep personal significance for her. Inside were letters from her family, a few photos of her fellow soldiers, and a notebook filled with entries she had written to cope with the stress of service. Settling into the seat, she felt the soft upholstery ease her tense muscles. She longed to close her eyes and savor this rare moment of peace she had so desperately missed. Yet, her thoughts kept drifting to home. Naomi thought of her mother, who had promised to cook her favorite dish, and her younger brother, who was likely preparing another joke to lighten the mood. Her heart filled with warmth but also with anxiety. Coming home always brought the question, would her family understand the person she had become after all she had been through? Soon, other passengers began boarding in the first-class cabin. Naomi was momentarily distracted, watching people take their seats. Among them was a man in his 50s wearing an expensive suit and carrying a dark leather briefcase. His tall stature, luxury watch, and stern expression marked him as someone accustomed to being the center of attention. The man took the seat across the aisle from Naomi, and she noticed his gaze linger on her uniform. He squinted, as if trying to process why an African-American woman in military attire was sitting in this luxurious cabin. The man appeared displeased, his movements growing more abrupt. He opened his laptop, but occasionally shot sideways glances at Naomi. Naomi knew this type of person all too well. As a child, she had been taught to recognize subtle forms of prejudice. She remembered how her father, a civil rights activist, had explained that discrimination could be quiet, almost imperceptible, but no less painful. This man, it seemed, embodied that very attitude. Her thoughts were interrupted as the flight attendant began the pre-flight safety briefing. Naomi looked out the window, trying to focus on her thoughts of home. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that her presence in first class was unsettling some of the other passengers. Every glance, every movement suggested that she was seen as an outsider. The plane began taxiing toward the runway. Naomi gripped the armrests and took a deep breath. She was ready for any challenge on duty, but each time she faced such reactions, she felt a slight tension. Her father's words echoed in her mind once more. Words can break down walls, but sometimes they themselves become the wall. The plane was gaining altitude, and the first-class passengers immersed in their activities seemed entirely at ease. Naomi tried to distract herself from her exhaustion by gazing out at the clouds through the window. Her thoughts were occupied with plans for the coming days, reuniting with her family, having a long conversation with her younger brother, and maybe, for the first time in months, getting a good night's sleep. Yet she could feel the tension building around her, emanating from the man seated across the aisle. Harrison Crawford, the CEO of Westbridge Consulting, still couldn't reconcile Naomi's presence in first class. His hands, which had previously rested calmly on the armrests, were now clenched into fists, and his gaze kept drifting back to her military uniform. He raised his eyebrows as if in disbelief, only to turn away momentarily, before glancing back again. Naomi was aware of this. She could feel his heavy stare, even when she tried her best to ignore it. For a moment, the cabin was quiet, as the flight attendant began offering drinks. It was in this moment that Harrison decided he could remain silent no longer. He raised his hand, catching the flight attendant's attention, and she approached him with a professional smile. However, her calm expression began to shift as he explained his issue. Harrison gestured animatedly, his movements growing more erratic as he pointed toward Naomi. He spoke about discrepancies and mistakes. His demeanor made it clear he was unhappy, but his words were carefully chosen to avoid outright accusations. It was a textbook example of subtle discrimination, not overt words, but thinly veiled hints and omissions that Naomi had learned to recognize as a teenager. The flight attendant maintained her professional composure, nodding and patiently listening to the man. Occasionally she glanced at Naomi, but she gave no indication that she was unsettled. Harrison, however, was relentless. His face flushed red, and his voice grew louder, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. A few people turned their heads, their expressions a mix of curiosity and mild discomfort. No one intervened, but it was clear many were aware that something awkward was unfolding. Naomi sat still, her face remaining completely neutral, though inside she was boiling. She knew that showing frustration could only worsen the situation. Her years of service had taught her how to maintain composure even in the most challenging circumstances. Quietly, she listened as the man tried to convince the flight attendant to have her moved to another seat. Throughout her life, Naomi had faced this kind of treatment. In school, her achievements were often doubted by teachers who believed she couldn't have accomplished it on her own. During military training, she sensed the unease of fellow soldiers who didn't expect her to withstand physical challenges on par with men. Even after earning the rank of sergeant, her successes were often attributed to luck rather than skill. But this situation in the first-class cabin still struck a nerve. Harrison seemed genuinely convinced that Naomi didn't belong there. His unwavering certainty, devoid of any doubt or second thought, felt like a challenge to everything she had overcome to reach where she was today. When the flight attendant checked Naomi's ticket and confirmed that she was indeed supposed to be in first class, Harrison fell silent. His face hardened, and his eyes reflected a mix of disappointment and irritation. He turned away but continued to radiate tension. Naomi caught snippets of whispered conversations among a few passengers, who murmured to one another as they tried to piece together what had just happened. Although the conflict had been officially resolved, the atmosphere remained heavy. Naomi could feel the eyes on her, even from those pretending to be engrossed in their phones or books. She hated moments like these, not because of one person's opinion, but because they were a reminder of how deeply rooted prejudice still was in society. Harrison opened his laptop pretending to focus on work, but Naomi noticed how he occasionally glanced at her from the corner of his eye. Her heart pounded, but she maintained her calm demeanor. Her father, a man who had always inspired her with his patience, often said, "Don't let anger dictate your actions. People see strength when you remain calm." Those words had become her anchor in moments like this. Outside the window, the plane had reached its cruising altitude, and soft clouds stretched endlessly below. Naomi shifted her gaze to them, trying to focus on something positive. Her thoughts returned to her family and her mother, who had always taught her to rise above pettiness and prejudice. Naomi knew that even small confrontations like this shaped her character. But today, she felt not only physically, but emotionally exhausted. After the conflict was formally resolved, the first-class cabin filled once again with a quiet hum. The flight attendant continued serving drinks, and passengers returned to their activities. Some opened laptops, others flipped through books or magazines. Yet for Naomi Green, the silence of the plane was deceptive. The tension from the earlier encounter lingered in the air, settling into her mind like an invisible weight. Naomi stared out the window, trying to focus on the serene view of clouds stretching endlessly to the horizon. Outside, the world seemed so distant, almost unreal, in stark contrast to her inner state. Each time she faced situations like this, Naomi reminded herself that it wasn't a personal attack. It was the product of deeply ingrained stereotypes and biases woven into the very fabric of society. Her thoughts drifted back to her childhood in suburban Detroit. She grew up in a neighborhood where the lines dividing white and African American communities were not just social, but physical. Schools, stores, and even buses often followed unwritten rules of segregation. Naomi remembered how her mother, an elementary school teacher, and her father, a civil rights activist, raised her and her older brother David with the firm belief that their future depended solely on their own efforts. As a child, Naomi often heard comments like, "You're too smart for a girl from this neighborhood," or "You'll be lucky if you even get into college." These remarks, disguised as compliments, always felt condescending. Even as a teenager, Naomi instinctively understood that such words were less about belief in her potential and more about doubting her worth. Her memories jumped to her early days in the military. She recalled how hard it was to earn respect in a male-dominated environment, where her physical endurance, intellect, and leadership qualities were often questioned because of her gender and race. She had to prove not only that she deserved her place, but that she could excel beyond many of her peers. One of her commanders once told her that the military was the great equalizer, where race, gender, and background didn't matter. But in practice, Naomi found that stereotypes had a way of seeping into military life as well. She overcame this with persistence, flawless discipline, and the support of others like her. Amid these memories, pleasant ones also surfaced. Naomi thought of those who helped her grow. For instance, her friend Carlos, with whom she completed basic training, often said her determination motivated him not to give up, or Captain Miller, who became a role model as a strong female officer effortlessly breaking down prejudices. These people reminded Naomi that she wasn't alone in her fight. Yet, despite these positive memories, today's incident affected her more deeply than she had expected. The conflict on the plane wasn't unique in her life, but it served as another reminder that her status, achievements, and identity could still be questioned simply because of her appearance. The experience was exhausting. At times, it felt like every step forward came with a new barrier. Naomi absent-mindedly ran her hand over her uniform, feeling the firm fabric and the perfectly polished insignia beneath her fingers. To her, this uniform was more than just clothing. It symbolized her strength, resilience, and the journey she had taken to earn the rank of sergeant. In the military, she found what society often refused to give her, respect based on her skills and character rather than the color of her skin. But even in the military, respect wasn't immediate. She recalled a time when her squad was tasked with a complex tactical exercise. Her proposal, though strategically sound, was ignored until another officer, a white man, suggested the exact same idea. That incident taught her an important lesson. Sometimes her voice wouldn't be heard, but that didn't mean she should remain silent. Suddenly, something pulled her out of her thoughts. Her seatmate across the aisle, Harrison Crawford, stirred again. He seemed to be trying to focus on his laptop, but his nervous gestures betrayed his unease. He continued to steal glances at Naomi, occasionally averting his eyes as though afraid she might catch him. Her presence clearly made him uncomfortable, but for Naomi, this was nothing new. She wondered what caused people like Harrison to react this way. Perhaps his prejudices stemmed from ignorance, nurtured in a sheltered, privileged environment. Perhaps he simply had never encountered people whose lives were so different from his own. Naomi knew that such barriers couldn't be dismantled with a single conversation. But she also believed that change was possible if people started seeing each other as more than just stereotypes. Naomi turned her gaze back to the clouds. Despite the inner tension, she resolved to stay true to her principles. She wouldn't let one person or one moment define her worth. Her life, her struggles, and her achievements spoke for themselves. It all started with a barely noticeable jolt that made the seats in the cabin tremble slightly. Naomi Green felt the vibration under her feet and immediately understood. The plane had entered a zone of turbulence. Her body instinctively tensed, but her face remained completely calm. She knew that the passengers around her might not share her confidence, especially those unaccustomed to such situations. From her own experience, she knew that turbulence rarely posed a real danger, but fear, a powerful force, could grip anyone. The passengers began exchanging glances, their voices quieting into a tense silence. The first noticeable reaction came from a woman across the aisle. Her hands gripped the armrests tightly, and her face had gone pale. Naomi noticed her shoulders trembling and realized the woman was on the verge of panic. It reminded her of moments in military transport planes when young soldiers were heading to the front lines for the first time. Many tried to mask their fear, but Naomi could see it in their eyes, their gestures, their shallow, nervous breaths. The turbulence grew stronger. The plane no longer just vibrated. It seemed to bounce on invisible waves of air. The soft hum of the cabin turned into a restless murmur. Several people pressed the call buttons for the flight attendants. Naomi saw a man 2 rows ahead try to unbuckle his seatbelt as if that might give him more freedom, only to fasten it again moments later. Someone else began pulling out the safety instructions, frantically studying the evacuation diagrams despite the lack of any real threat. Naomi turned her attention to the woman across the aisle. She was sitting with her eyes closed, her lips moving faintly as if whispering a prayer. Her breathing was irregular, and her hands gripping the armrests had turned white from the strain. Naomi knew that if the woman gave in to panic, it could quickly spread to other passengers. Her instincts as a leader kicked in. Naomi leaned forward slightly to catch the woman's attention. Her movements were slow and deliberate, projecting calm and control. When the woman finally opened her eyes, they met Naomi's gaze. Her years in the military had taught Naomi an important skill: how to communicate not just with words, but with her expression, gestures, and presence. Her eyes conveyed a clear message. "You're safe. Everything is under control." The woman began to take deeper breaths, mirroring Naomi, who intentionally demonstrated slow, measured inhales and exhales. Within minutes, the woman's fingers loosened their grip on the armrests, and her breathing evened out. She didn't say a word, but her eyes were filled with gratitude. The turbulence persisted. Each new jolt of the plane made passengers flinch. Some began whispering to one another, questioning the safety of the situation. Naomi overheard fragments of their conversations. "Is this normal? Isn't it too rough? Why aren't the pilots saying anything?" These words filled the cabin with an invisible current of fear that threatened to escalate into collective panic. For Naomi, the moment was another reminder of her service. She recalled a day when their military plane came under fire and bullets pierced the fuselage. People around her screamed, some cried, but Naomi stayed composed. Back then, as now, her role was not to succumb to emotions, but to maintain control of the situation. Her calmness had become an anchor for others, helping to save lives. The sounds of heavy breathing and nervous movements surrounded her in the first-class cabin, but instead of fear, Naomi felt a familiar sense of focus. She glanced again at the woman across the aisle, then at the young parents with a baby in their arms seated just ahead, and finally at the man 2 rows away, whose hands were now visibly trembling. Her presence seemed to have a calming effect on those around her, even though she hadn't spoken a word. Her composed movements and steady gaze communicated more than any words could. Harrison Crawford, seated across the aisle, continued to watch Naomi. His expression, once filled with irritation and skepticism, had softened into something more contemplative. He observed how Naomi remained unflappable and how she quietly helped those around her without uttering a single word. Something inside him began to shift. He could no longer dismiss her as just a woman in a uniform. His face grew pensive, though he remained silent, as if processing everything he was witnessing. The turbulence began to subside. The jolts grew less frequent until they finally ceased altogether. A few minutes later, the captain's voice came over the intercom, assuring passengers that they had successfully navigated through the turbulent zone. People began to relax. Some leaned back in their seats with audible sighs of relief. Others reached for their water glasses, and a few simply closed their eyes to rest. The woman across the aisle met Naomi's gaze again. Her face now showed relief, and she gave a small nod, pressing her hands to her chest in gratitude. That simple gesture meant more to Naomi than any words could. Naomi leaned back in her seat, resting against the headrest. Her eyes returned to the window, where the serene blue sky stretched endlessly beyond the glass. Her thoughts wandered back to recent memories. She understood that this episode of turbulence was not just a physical trial, but an emotional one. It reminded her of the importance of inner resilience, especially when others were looking to her for strength. Her gaze lingered briefly on Harrison. His demeanor had changed. He no longer turned away dismissively or looked down on her. Now he seemed thoughtful, lost in his own reflections. Naomi could tell that his prejudice was beginning to crack. Perhaps for the first time in a long while, he was confronting a reality that didn't fit neatly into his familiar framework. For Naomi, this moment was yet another lesson. She knew that changes in perception didn't happen instantly, but even small steps mattered. Her father always said, "You can't change everyone, but every person you reach is a victory." Naomi believed that her actions, even the smallest ones, could plant the seeds of change. After the plane left the turbulence behind, the passengers gradually returned to their activities. Yet Naomi Green couldn't shake the tension that still lingered in the air. She understood that for some, her place in first class remained an anomaly. This flight had become a microcosm of society for her, where biases and stereotypes surfaced in even the smallest details. Her gaze rested on her backpack in the overhead compartment. She knew it held her notebook, a small item that had accompanied her through the toughest moments of her service. That notebook was her way of expressing her thoughts, coping with accumulated emotions, and making sense of what was happening around her. Naomi carefully retrieved the notebook and a pen, trying to center herself. Her movements were slow and deliberate, almost meditative, as if she were trying to calm her inner unease. She opened to a blank page and paused, wondering where to begin. Fragmented thoughts filled her mind, the recent conflict with a passenger, memories of her service, and the challenges she had faced. Her hand began to move across the page. She wrote about what it meant to be a woman in the military, especially an African-American woman. About how often she had to prove her competence and overcome stereotypes. She recalled her early days in the service, when her ideas and suggestions were ignored until voiced by someone else. She wrote about how difficult it was to fight for respect while staying true to herself. Naomi reflected on her journey. Her parents, who had always inspired her, had taught her never to give up. Her father, a civil rights activist, often told her that change comes through action, not aggression. Her mother, an elementary school teacher, faced daily challenges but continued to work, believing that every small effort could make a difference in someone's life. These lessons had become the foundation of her character. She described how her military uniform had become a symbol not only of her achievements, but also of her struggle. Her successes were not accidental. They were the result of years of hard work and countless personal sacrifices. She recalled moments when she wanted to give up, but found the strength to keep going, because she knew her success was important not only for herself, but for others who looked up to her. Her thoughts returned to the recent conflict. She didn't feel anger. just exhaustion. Exhaustion from the need to repeatedly explain that she had earned her place. But instead of retreating into herself, Naomi resolved to try reaching out to those who viewed her through the lens of prejudice. She didn't know if it would change anyone's opinion, but she believed that trying was already a step in the right direction. When she finished writing, she paused and reread the text. Her words felt honest, free of blame or anger. She simply shared her story as someone who had come a long way and wanted to be understood. This letter wasn't about judgment, but about an attempt to find common ground. Naomi carefully tore the page from her notebook, folded it, and set it aside. She leaned back in her seat, her eyes once again drawn to the window. Outside, endless clouds stretched to the horizon, their soft contours reminding her of the peace she so desperately craved. She felt she had done what she believed was right. Her goal wasn't to prove anything, but to create an opportunity for reflection. She noticed the man across the aisle glancing at her from time to time. His tension was still apparent, but Naomi saw changes in his demeanor. He no longer turned away with overt disdain. His gaze had become more contemplative, as if he were trying to process what had happened. The letter lay on the tray table before her. Naomi wasn't planning to hand it over immediately, giving herself a little more time to ensure she had made the right choice. She believed that sometimes words could break down the walls people built between themselves, but she also knew that doing so required patience. As the flight attendant passed by again, Naomi handed her the letter, nodding toward the man across the aisle. She watched as the flight attendant took the envelope with a professional smile and delivered it to its recipient. Naomi averted her gaze, giving the man the space to read the letter at his own pace. Her attention returned to the window, where the setting sun painted the sky in warm hues. She didn't know if he would read the letter right away or set it aside. To her it didn't matter. What mattered was that she had taken a step forward. After the smooth landing, passengers began leaving their seats. The sounds of overhead bins opening, flight attendants announcing the arrival, and the hurried footsteps of people eager to disembark blended into the familiar symphony of an airport. Naomi Green calmly gathered her belongings and headed toward the exit, trying to ignore the gaze she could still feel on her. The man, Harrison Crawford, seated across the aisle, no longer made abrupt movements or hostile gestures, but Naomi knew his presence was still palpable. As she entered the terminal, the familiar airport scent, a mix of coffee, cleaning products, and machine oil, brought her back to reality. She moved calmly but purposefully, focusing on her route to the baggage claim. People bustled in all directions, but for Naomi, time seemed to slow. Each step was deliberate, her thoughts still lingering on the atmosphere of the recent flight. Naomi reached the conveyor belt and waited for her backpack. She scanned the crowd around her, looking for a sense of calm in their faces, but instead noticed a man moving toward her. It was Harrison Crawford. He walked slowly, as if hesitant to come closer, but his gaze was fixed directly on her. His face looked different now. The tension that once dominated his expression had softened into a mix of discomfort and determination. Naomi knew this moment would come. She couldn't predict what he would say or do, but she was ready. Internally, she felt that his presence here wasn't a coincidence. The man stopped a few steps away from her. His posture was uncertain, yet conveyed that he had mustered enough resolve to face her. In his hands, Naomi noticed the letter, the folded piece of paper she had sent him through the flight attendant. Harrison unfolded it slowly, as if reaffirming the meaning of the words written there. His gaze rose to meet hers, and in his eyes, Naomi saw something she rarely encountered in people like him: understanding. Naomi said nothing, letting him take the lead, but his gestures and expressions spoke louder than words. She saw him struggling to find the right thoughts to articulate something that, perhaps for the first time in a long while, made him pause and reflect. His lips tightened briefly before relaxing, as though he debated whether to speak or simply walk away. But he stayed. Harrison raised his eyes again, and with some effort, made a gesture that acknowledged his behavior on the plane had been unjust. His realization had clearly not come easily. This moment was new for him, and likely uncomfortable. A man accustomed to being in control now stood before her in the role of someone admitting a mistake. Naomi remained still, giving him the space and time he needed. She understood that moments like these were rare. Her letter wasn't meant to accuse, but to explain. She believed in the power of sincerity to break down the walls of prejudice, though she hadn't expected her words to have such an effect. Harrison pulled the letter from his pocket again, glancing at it as if seeking reassurance in her words. Naomi noticed his fingers trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the internal tension of someone grappling with a newfound awareness. He didn't speak loudly, but his gestures and expression conveyed his regret. She could see that he genuinely felt remorse for what had happened. His acknowledgement and apology weren't signs of weakness. They were evidence of strength, of a man who had managed to overcome his own biases and beliefs. Harrison appeared unsure of what to do next. He slipped the letter back into his pocket and gave a small nod in her direction. It was a sign of respect, perhaps the first genuine gesture he had shown since their conflict began. Naomi accepted it. She didn't smile, but her expression softened, and her gaze grew warmer. Her body remained still, but inside she felt a sense of relief. She saw that her story, her words, had reached someone who initially viewed her only through the lens of a stereotype. The man stood silently for a few more seconds before turning and walking away, disappearing into the crowd. Naomi watched him leave but didn't say anything. For her, this moment marked the conclusion of what had started on the plane. She knew that this small step might have changed not just his perception of her, but also how he approached others in the future. When her backpack finally appeared on the conveyor belt, Naomi picked it up, slung it over her shoulder, and headed toward the exit. Her thoughts were calm, yet full. She understood that moments like these wouldn't change the world, but each one was a building block in the wall of progress. She believed that even a single sincere acknowledgement could be the beginning of something greater. As she exited the terminal, the bright sunlight greeted her. Ahead, she saw her family waiting with joyful smiles, but before heading toward them, she paused for a moment, took a deep breath, and glanced back one last time. The crowd moved in every direction, and Harrison was already gone, but his gestures and realization stayed with her. After the events at the airport, Naomi Green felt the tension within her gradually dissipating. She was on her way home to her family, but the encounter with Harrison Crawford lingered in her thoughts. This time, her emotions were not colored by anger or frustration, but by something different. A quiet pride in having conveyed her story to someone who had initially refused to listen. At home, Naomi was greeted with joy. Her parents and younger brother stood at the door, embracing her tightly, as if afraid to let her go again. Their house, small but cozy, filled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and her mother's homemade pies, felt like a fortress. Here, she could simply be herself, without having to defend her right to exist. Over dinner, Naomi recounted her flight, though she consciously left out the conflict with Harrison. She wasn't ready to share every detail. Her father, a former civil rights activist, listened intently as always, not only hearing her words but sensing what lay between them. He noticed a change in her tone, something new, something that hadn't been there before. Later, Naomi found a moment to be alone. She stepped out into the backyard, where her family often gathered in the evenings. The garden, lush and green, was her sanctuary for reflection. Her gaze drifted to the stars emerging in the darkening sky. Once again, she thought of Harrison and how he had approached her in the terminal. His embarrassed expression and gestures, reflecting his inner struggle, stayed with her. She understood that this wasn't just a moment of reconciliation. It was the result of years of fighting for equality, for the chance to be heard. Harrison hadn't become her friend, nor had he changed the world in a single encounter, but he had taken a step. That step meant more than any apology. Naomi realized that her letter, her words, and her story could indeed be tools for change. The next day, Naomi received an unexpected email. It had been sent to the address she had provided when filling out the flight form. The email was from Harrison Crawford. His message was measured but sincere. He admitted that his behavior on the flight had been unfair and that Naomi's letter had made him reflect. He wrote about how narrow his view of the world had been and expressed gratitude for the way she had shared her perspective without accusation or condescension. Naomi read the email several times before responding. Her reply was brief but heartfelt. She didn't want to persuade him or continue the conversation. Her goal was to support his first step toward change. She wrote that she appreciated his honesty and that perhaps this was the beginning of his journey toward a better understanding of the world around him. These events inspired Naomi to think deeply. She realized that her experiences were not just personal stories, but something greater. She began to consider how she might share her insights with others, helping them see the world from a different perspective. Ideas began to take shape in her mind. She wanted to find a way to speak to larger audiences so her voice could reach those who had never encountered stories like hers. In the following days, Naomi reached out to a local veterans organization where she had previously participated in events. She proposed hosting a series of talks for young people, sharing her experiences in the military, the challenges of discrimination, and how to overcome barriers. Her proposal was met with enthusiasm, and within weeks, she was standing before her first audience of high school students. Naomi spoke with confidence, her voice calm yet firm. She shared her stories, demonstrating that her achievements were the result of hard work, perseverance, and a belief in equality. Her accounts were rich with detail, leaving many students in awe. Some asked questions, while others simply listened attentively. But Naomi could see genuine interest in their eyes. Her words didn't just inspire the youth. Teachers and community members attending the talks also found her story thought-provoking. Naomi saw how her experiences began to resonate with people, how her words became a catalyst for change. Harrison Crawford remained just an episode in her life, but his presence became a symbol of the possibility of transformation. Naomi knew her journey wasn't over, that the fight for equality was a long process requiring patience and effort. But she also knew that every person capable of changing their perspective was already a victory. Several months had passed since Naomi Green returned home, but the events of that day on the airplane and in the terminal remained vivid in her memory. Those moments had become more than just an unpleasant encounter or a small act of acknowledgement. They had prompted her to reflect on the role her story could play in the lives of others. She felt deeply that her words and experiences had the power to change perceptions, even if such change took time. She couldn't ignore the internal call for action. Naomi began to think about how she could use her experiences to help others. This became her personal mission, not just to defend herself against injustice, but to actively challenge it through words and deeds. A few weeks after returning home, Naomi applied to speak at a conference dedicated to equality and social justice. The event annually brought together people from diverse backgrounds to share their stories, propose solutions, and inspire one another. Her application was accepted, and she was given the opportunity to address a large audience. Naomi spent countless hours preparing for her speech. She reread entries in her notebook, made revisions, and added new thoughts. Her talk had to be honest, sincere, and compelling. She wanted her audience not just to hear her, but to feel her story. She decided to share her life in the military, the biases she had faced, and what it was like to be an African American woman in a system that often saw her as an exception. The day of the conference arrived, and the hall was packed. Naomi was nervous, but as she stepped onto the stage, she felt a surge of confidence. Her voice was steady, and each word resonated with the audience. She spoke about her journey, the importance of perseverance in the face of bias, and how change begins with each of us. She shared personal stories, emphasizing that every success was not just about individual effort, but also the support of those who believed in her. After her speech, people approached Naomi to thank her for her honesty and inspiration. Among them, she noticed a familiar figure. It was Harrison Crawford. He looked different. His face no longer bore arrogance, but humility. Harrison explained that her letter and their encounter had led him to reevaluate many of his beliefs. He had begun studying history, spending more time reflecting on his actions, and had even joined initiatives aimed at combating discrimination. He expressed his gratitude to Naomi, saying that her words had sparked the changes in him. This meeting made Naomi reflect on how vital it was to continue sharing her experiences. If one person could change their perception, how many more might be inspired by her story? She decided to dedicate herself to creating programs that would help veterans and young people learn how to overcome barriers and fight for equality. Returning home, Naomi began planning a new project. She reached out to local organizations and proposed holding lectures for high school and college students. Her proposal was met with enthusiasm, and soon she began speaking in schools, sharing her journey. She saw how her words transformed the perspectives of young people, how they started asking questions and seeking answers. A few months later, her project gained national recognition. People from across the country reached out to share their stories or offer their support. Naomi knew her work was only beginning, but she felt she was on the right path. One evening, sitting in her backyard, Naomi reflected on the road she had traveled, from her military service to confronting bias, from writing a letter on a plane to creating a national project. Her life had changed, but her values remained steadfast. She still believed that understanding and sincerity could break down any barriers. Her phone vibrated. It was a message from a student who had attended one of her lectures. He wrote that her story had inspired him to become the first in his family to attend college. Naomi smiled as she read his words. She realized her efforts had not been in vain. Every step, every story, every encounter was leading her towards something greater. Naomi Green knew her work would never be easy, but she was ready for the challenges. She was confident that as long as there were people willing to listen, her voice would be heard. With this thought, she looked up at the stars, feeling that her journey was only just beginning.